Hello, dear friends. Thank you very much for coming back. Today we are having the sixth lecture entitled Current Global Trends and Russian Society, which is the part of the course Russian Studies, offered you by the Russian Academy of National Economy and Public Administration under the President of the Russian Federation. In this lecture, we will look at the most acute global trends in the modern Russian society. So firstly, let's have a look at the problem of the changing structural composition of Russia. So you may ask me, why again transformation, what changes? But after all, the Russian state is not so young. It's about 1,000 years of its history. But if we speak about social transformation, we can say that real transformation started just 30 years ago, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Before the Soviet Union and in its states, there were absolutely different political and social systems. So the systems of power were also very different. In real modern Russia, it is a very new system, very young, and it undergoes some structural changes, especially in such a young state, as which cannot be compared to anything which were seen previously. That's why we need to stand on this and discuss those questions separately. So, as I said, that Russian nation and the state, the society in general, undergoes specific transformation. For instance, the concept all Russian hasn't been very well developed, although a Russian government is doing a lot to develop it. And the formation of the nation exists, and the Russian state is doing a lot to ensure its formation. However, there were some difficulties after the numerous social problems which appeared after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the new stages of the development of Russia, and a lot of mistakes which were made. However, the system is being made, and I would like to show you today what is the Russian society in general. Primarily, in the Soviet Union, the situation with structural composition was very simple. So there was a general equality of all types of population. People had, of course, some lower ruling classes, which were entitled nomenklatura. They had very privileged position, but they were very unnumerous. So the majority of population, the broad layer, were the working class, the peasantry, and all other types of employees. They were quite equal in their opportunities. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the situation has changed, of course, and now the composition has changed as well. We cannot say that the formation of quality of life also has changed considerably, and with that, the social stratification appeared. Of course, there is inequality right now, but this is more typical for all societies and all structural societies. As you know, that in any society there are such classes as middle class, which is the foundation of all normally developing societies. It is typical for all capitalists. Currently, it represents about 50 or 60% of all the Russian population. As if you could compare that to the social Soviet Union, where the situation with the majority was about 80% of population. So the situation is really different right now. And this middle class is formed from other social strata, as if we compare that with the other liberal capitalist nations. So initially it was assumed that middle class is formed from people who are the owners of means of production, if you remember Karl Marx's theory. So they have the instruments of production, capital, land, real estate, etc. So these are the owners, the middle class in the capitalist society. But in Russia, the situation is different. We are talking about middle class, like a more broad layer. So these are people who don't have economic opportunities, we call them. This can be highly qualified workers, employees, not only white-collar specialists, but also blue-collar specialists, maybe some sophisticated machinery operators, qualified personnel, owners of enterprises, small businesses, etc. So they are the majority of Russian society, as probably especially in big cities. We will talk about that later. And they are prone to economic adaptation, and they are very adaptable, and this is a bit different class. We will also discuss that among those people, as we said, 50 or 60% of all the population, the quality of life is represented by very wide opportunities, and they have specific social standards as well. So those social standards in Russian middle class differ from those of typical Western countries. So maybe a bit more limited, not as in the Western countries. So, as I said, that if there is middle class, there are also representatives of upper groups, and they are counted at 11 and 20%. They are characterized by predominance of life opportunities, life chances. They have resources of influence at work, the managerial positions, advantages in purchasing power, comfortable living standards, etc. And of course, there is certain instability of their position, of the upper group. So let me remind you that we are talking about the mass population, not about the separate elites, but just the majority, the higher class. So in this upper stratum. So if everything is fine, the life has good chances, and they are belonging to it. However, if something bad happens, or inability, disability maybe, if they are not able to maintain their position at work for a long time, or maybe there are just some other negative factors, they may lose this position. If we speak about the general features, characteristics of this class, these are people with higher education who have bachelor degrees or master's degrees. They are qualified personnel, and as I said, that generally occupying very high positions at work. But there is the chance of low stability for their well-being. There are social changes, and they also include the changes in over the Russian society, that there is also a growing number of people living below the poverty line. The poverty line is the line of economic opportunity for citizens who, while performing their work, they have the jobs, but they do not earn enough money. They cannot enjoy all the benefits of that current economy can provide for them. And the situation has arisen where some people have theoretical opportunity to enjoy those benefits, for instance, paid health care and education. Theoretically, they can afford to buy, for instance, new household appliances, washing machines, refrigerators, TVs, but in fact, they cannot afford this. So, and the number of people, especially in families with numerous children, is currently not ideal. So the level of poverty in Russia and children's poverty is quite high. So we were speaking about getting into one's another stratum, so-called social mobility. It considerably in Russia depends on human capital, so available resources, because there is an important point that the nature of employment can also explain the opportunities of social mobility. We spoke about portraits of the groups, and they are very clear that, for instance, managers, specialists with higher education should be at the bottom, and mainly workers, employees, people from trade sector are at the lower ranks. However, according to research, some people have a more privileged position, and of course these are primarily young people with higher education, and those living in big cities, primarily Moscow, St. Petersburg and some regional capitals. They have much better chances of getting to the top, so getting out of this trouble zone if they were ever there. So this possibility of urban development and social lifts there are much higher than in villages and in small towns in Russia. Of course, this is an ambiguous divide, and representatives of all groups are everywhere, in all territories. But in some territories of Russia, those shares differ. And as I said, 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we can state that there is the upward mobility. It is unnoticeable. There are more opportunities for people. Just if we compare the situation with 30 years, like in my even childhood, the situation is different now. However, the social mobility lifts still exist, and it is very positive trend. However, they require the increase in the opportunities. One of the possibility to get better social position is, of course, education. And according to the statistics, Russia has the world's one of the largest share of population with a professional education. It may be secondary vocational education from community colleges, or people from universities getting bachelor and master's degrees on PhDs, etc. So it is, according to Russian statistical data, 25% of Russians have secondary vocational education, and a lot of them have higher education. And you can see that, for instance, if we compare this with the United States, where only 11% of the residents have secondary vocational education, the situation is quite different. So in Russia, it is about 34%. In China, the situation is a bit even more difficult, so with 60% of residents having secondary vocational education and 35% the bachelor degrees. As I said, that it is calculated the proportion to the proportion of the population. So the education, higher education, is not always the possibility to get a good placement, a good job. Some people understand that even with higher education, some jobs cannot provide them enough to pay for this education, to pay off their students' loan. But this trend is also very important. So at least given the chance to people to go for the first time in their family and get those higher education is very important. So the lower group, which is represented by 30 or approximately 20-30%, those people typically they do not have higher education. They don't even have just have the finished general common education. So this limits their opportunities, of course. We will discuss, we have discussed with you the structure of Russian society. We can speak about this much longer, but firstly I would like you to have a look and understand the position of Russia and our attitude towards some global trends. So the modern world, as you know, has entered the next phase of its systemic transformation as well. So what has those transformations led to? It's of course there are a lot of debates going on. In the meantime, we can talk about with certainty that there are some so-called global trends taking place right now, and those trends are ongoing. They of course have their impact on Russia. So the first trend is the trend of the world economic center gravity shifting to so-called global south. Of course, Western countries are losing their former economic hegemony. So the economic breakthrough of China, India has fundamentally changed the balance of powers globally. As you know, China has surpassed the United States in terms of the GDP if we compare it with purchasing power parity. India, from the 9th position, which it occupied in 1990s, went to the global economy. It moved to the 3rd position. So Indonesia emerged, which were even absent from the top 10s. Instead, with this, the Pacific Ocean became the main waterway of the trade. And, of course, Russia's reorientation to the global south, its strategic priorities are in accordance with these modern trends and this vector. It is also reflected in the economy and our trade partnerships. The next trend is the trend towards unipolarity. So the end of the unipolarity. The system of unipolar world, which also had real chances for political implementation after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it encountered serious resistance from a number of non-Western powers, non-Western nations. And the first major political figure to characterize unipolarity and the necessity to get rid of it was Russian President Vladimir Putin during the Munich conference. It was back in 2007 when he said that the crisis of unipolarity is manifested not only with the loss of economic leadership by the West, and the modernization of the armed forces of Russia and China has changed a bit the balance of powers in military, industrial, and technical sphere. So there are serious changes in this area. And if we compare the priorities and the perceptions of some Western leaders of the development of human potential, we can state that it has also changed. So the formidable superiority of some countries, in particular in the US, their economic power has gone under threat because we all know about the booming expenses on wars which they conduct around the world. They are losing their power of the global leader, currently having horrible fiscal debt, etc. So persistently current accounts of deficit of the US makes it borrow from abroad at unprecedented rate, which also contributes to the loss of leadership positions. And the situation with the COVID-19 pandemics, it also has demonstrated that such important spheres as healthcare, for instance, of some countries, even well-developed countries, had significant flaws and could not cope with the extreme pandemic challenges. So it also shows that the leadership positions are being lost. Of course, we say that there are some red lines which were crossed by some nations. We cannot in Russia support those Western patterns of behavior which they are trying to impose on other countries. For instance, the children's transgender surgeries which are conducted even without the permit of the parents, or children can be removed from the custody of their parents if they don't want for their child to undergo serious transgender surgeries. These are some red lines which in Russia we cannot agree with, and we cannot impose those things on Russian society. So consolidating all these trends, it's very important to record that Russia today is at the forefront of the forces which advocate for the multipolar world, and BRICS and other corporations help us with this. And we were speaking about wars. This is a very negative trend, which unfortunately is continues to take place in the world. So the military tensions rise. Of course, some Western geopolitical powers contributed a lot to the development of those people and of those conflicts, terrible conflicts, and instability which we face right now. We are trying to fulfill some functions to maintain fair world. Russia tries to undergo this and to ensure strategic stability. Russia has to defend our role, so our position in the world, which is undermined by a color revolution, by some uprisings, coups d'etats, which take place around the world, and they are financed by Western military and special services, unfortunately. And the military escalations which are taking place, of course, they increase the risks of using nuclear power, nuclear weapons, which is, of course, the disaster for humanity, and we don't want this. We, as Kennedy said at some period of his life, social people, as Russian people, are the same people. We want to have children, we want to develop our society, we don't want to have nuclear power applied, but just we don't want to be forced to do that as the last resort. The social polarization. Social polarization, as we speak about with you a bit earlier, in Russian society, it also exists, the inequality. But in the world, it intensifies at an even higher pace. So, for instance, we speak about the formation of multi-story building of humanity, and which causes consolidation of inequality. So, over the past decades, the conventional 50% threshold of material wealth is owned by the richest 1%. It has also been passed. Thus, historical maximum of inequality has been reached. We can say now that because of those colossal differences in resource capabilities, in access to resources, the principle of equality of the United Nations and the Declaration of the United Nations of the Human Rights is, of course, undermined. This principle is no longer respected. And the difference in level of life allows us to talk about the difference of worlds of opportunities. The social inequality corresponds to regional inequality. At the beginning, we remember with you that in the 19th century, when those studies were conducted, with the history of colonialism, there was a serious income gap between people who had the opportunities, the means of production, and the poorest countries. For instance, this differences was 3%, but currently the gap is 70-fold. 70, it's just so much. And the system of inequality of civilization, it is established, and it can be defined as neo-colonialism and even neo-racism. The trend of value contradiction growth. So, of course, this is the next very important trend. There are differences in values, in national values in each country, of course, and some universal values, common values for the whole world. However, some countries, especially as we spoke about, Western countries, have crossed the red lines. They break any logical and traditional norms which are manifested in the value civilizational conflicts. So, as I said, those transgender problems, the surgeries without parental consent in some countries. This is just the conflict of values which Russian civilization cannot withstand. Our traditional civilization have clearly indicated our reluctance to follow this path. and it provoked a lot of negative criticism from Western countries, speaking that we are not respecting other people's norms. However, those general values are seriously undermined. So in 2022, there was the decree adopted by the Russian president, number 809. If you remember, we were speaking about it at one of our lectures, which declares the approval of fundamentals of the Russian society, of preservation of and strengthening of Russian society values, moral values, spiritual values, which outline our ideas and the necessity to maintain common general ideas and values. Another trend is the threat to threat of demographic transition, another demographic transition. In accordance with the theory of demographic transition, the trend of natural reproduction of the population consists of objective increase in life expectancy, and the decrease in birth rate. So we can say that many Western nations, and including Russia, due to these trends, are objectively aging. So as a consequence, the retirement, when people go to the pension, this age is rising as well. So the movement for Russia correspondent of this trend is also complicated by the fact that the birth rate is lower than the death rate. That's why the 2024 year was named the Year of the Family in Russia. However, those measures are not always enough. There is the national project Demography in Russia, which is also trying to change the situation. But the birth rate doesn't reach the level of natural population reproduction. And this is a serious threat for the Russian society. At the same time, the countries that preserve institutional traditional society, for instance, Egypt and Iran, despite the general trends, they still have high childbirth rate with an increase of life expectancy, and this causes considerable population growth. So these emerging disproportions between countries of population and countries of high rates and low rates of natural population growth are resolved through immigration, not always legal. And we will talk about this process in Russia as well. So the illegal and legal immigration and the dynamic of migration flows affect directly all European and Western countries, and Russia as well, and of course North America. The catalyst of migration is wars and some social inequality upheavals, which are associated, of course, with instability, with global instability. We find ourselves in different cultural environment, of course, and even the migrants which come to other countries not always can adopt well to living standards of the host countries, and this might lead and leads really to social conflicts, social inequality. And in Russia, we also, as I said, have a serious lack of a population. So we are a demographic recipient of population, but if in Europe it is mainly post-colonial countries which migrate to Europe, in the Soviet Union, we accept people from the former Soviet Union republics. So they are descendants of the Russian Federation, and probably due to the fact that those changes, those migrants which come to Russia, that we do not have the same level of confrontation and migrant crisis in Russia than, for instance, if we compare that with Europe. So they adopt quite well to this situation. The bubble economy trend is also an important one. Some countries live beyond their means. As we spoke about that, they transfer some of the weights of their problems to global economy. As our president said, they live like parasites on the global economy, and their monopoly of dollar He said that back in 2011 when he was a prime minister. And here is an assessment of the given modern world economy as the universe, as we speak about the Club of Rome. There was the statement that currently 89% of all financial transactions are speculative in nature, and around 32 trillions are hidden in offshore zones. Oversupply of capital, which goes to some profitable areas, while other areas, territories of the planet depend very much on different, for instance, IVF, monetary foundations, and experience the serious shortage of funds. So we were speaking about the Club of Rome, which sensationally announced the systematic crisis of capitalist economy and said that it requires fundamental revision. However, the economy is still the same. The soap bubble still exists. There is the growth of dollar supply in some countries. There's speculations. So those coming shocks, which are probable because of the collapse of this bubble, are inevitable. And for some countries, sooner or later, especially for those countries which are dependent on dollar. So aware of these facts of inflation and inflating the dollar so bubble, Russia tries to get rid of some assets contained in American dollars, and we conduct right now the process of de-dollarization. So the transition to settlement in national currencies, and all trade exchanges should be conducted in national currencies. However, we're still in the process. 21st century was marked by terrorist increase. As you know, the World Trade Center was exploded, and it was just the symbol of new reality. Rise of terrorism is associated with possibility to achieve very quickly some means of people through terrorist attacks, achieving maximum resonance. Various religious, ethnic, political groups which do not have access to resources and are unable to achieve their goals through democratic means, they resort to terrorist attacks. And there are even entire terrorist states which are created in the Middle East, and the Russian armed forces have made significant contribution to the defeat of those groups and operations. So, however, modern geopolitical divisions, they prevent such work from being systematic. And some facts have been discovered that some global geopolitical players, they support terrorist organizations for their own political purposes. And a very important trend of digitalization and the uniformation of space is represented in Russia as well. So the development of internet and artificial intelligence with unprecedented speed has changed our life fundamentally. The opportunities of person to demonstrate their subjectivity in choosing information and the content and creating their own content have increased. Many procedures of everyday life, of course, are simplified. For instance, we use sat-nav when we try to move around the city instead of maps, or Google Translator instead of ordinary translator books and texts. But with those rises of new opportunities, of course, new risks occur, and this oversaturated information space causes some less so-called rational ignorance. You know, when person refuses to check information which comes to him through the internet, and maybe which seems attractive through some media, social media, and via opinion leaders. Some people refuse to think themselves, or spread of ChatGPT when people rely on it for writing their own texts is very widespread and is growing. But as you know, those situation can be very dangerous, because if we don't use something, we don't need that and we can lose it. And this is a very, very serious threat, that we can rely too much on those new technologies and end up without jobs or opportunities. So as well, you know, the situation with algorithm which promote some ideas and some shares, especially on international platform belonging to some tech giants, they can be used to promote some agenda, or on the contrary silence some negative opinions. And so there is opportunity and technique for manipulating mass consciousness as it was previously. For instance, there is a recent example from International Court of Justice when South Africa started presenting their evidence about horrific genocidal acts of Israel in Gaza after the 7th October attack, and what they are doing there. So this information was not accessible from the United States. It was impossible to find, not in a single media, and our colleagues from other universities has to access this information through Al Jazeera website. So as the conclusion is that all those links are always controlled by those who own them. It's not always possible, and we shouldn't rely completely on those technologies. And of course, it's very well known that through social networks, mobilization of opposition takes place, and a lot of color revolution were conducted using those social media technologies. The networks, along with those specific materials useful for people, they turned out to be the concentration of hate speech and some corruption contents. So it is obvious that it's impossible to completely isolate yourself from global information space and modern technologies, realities, but it's necessary to find the answers to challenges which arise from that, which correlate with the values, with the agenda, and Russia is trying to do so. We understand that the development of artificial intelligence is also controlled by those who own those corporations. So Russia can't stand aside and is also an active player in the development of our own technologies. At least we are trying to get into this area and not to be too much dependent on technology controlled by global corporations in Silicon Valley, who strive to gain complete dominance of individuals, and just with the development of so-called everything apps. So when everything is just in one app, which provides unlimited control over society to other people. So as I said, Russian president also was speaking about the necessity of our social and economic and technological independence. This is the sovereignty which requires our own technologies to be developed, not to be dependent on monopolists. Another important trend is, of course, environmental crisis. Nothing new here. It's technogenic nature, and of course, its ever-increasing impact on the nature, on population. With the anthropogenic factor, we speak about the deforestation, the air-water pollution, the decrease of biodiversity, desertification, lack of drinking water, and other negative impacts on our planet. And it is possible to prevent them. It is possible to renew the attitude of modern humanity to our nature, to our earth. Some countries pose a transition to green technologies and the introduction of new technologies and sustainable development. Russia is the member of many important organizations and signed agreements on climate summit in Glasgow, for instance, in 2021. We focus on conservation of natural resources. The ability, Russia, as you know, has a potential of forests, blockage of harmful impact on the nature of development. So we're trying to rely on our own unique resources and existing forests ecosystems to absorb some negative impact of carbon dioxide, and of course trying to implement some new technologies. And speaking about the resources, it's inevitable that sooner or later the resources will be depleted. In the future, humanity must face this, and in particular the base of non-renewable resources, non-renewable energy, which are of course being depleted. And the perspective of upcoming resources shortage, especially of capitalization of Russia as the most resource-rich country. You remember we spoke that 22% of all the global resources of raw materials are concentrated in this country. So those perspectives should increase significantly. So our Russia's natural potential allows us to realistically assess the possibility of our future and emergence of leading position in the global economy. However, this requires finding the optimum functioning of the Russian state system and overcoming some previous gaps, some problems of the current policy, and of course, and as we said, economic sovereignty and transition from resource exporting model of economy to innovative and sustainable one. At the same time, it is necessary to develop some promising technologies for the future when transition to new energy resources is made. So a system must be created that excludes the country's dependence on any external situation. Another trend is loss of national sovereignty of some countries. So out of more than 200 states of the modern world, not all of them have real sovereignty. Many nominally depend on other states to make some political decisions for them, and which are clearly manifested in acceptance of anti-Russian, for instance, agenda or Zionist agenda imposed by the United States right now. So in fact, the majority of European states, they turned out to be quite desovereignized, as we call them, so without their real sovereignty. For instance, those explosion of Nord Stream pipeline conducted by Ukrainian and American forces of Germany didn't provoke any considerable reaction from German society. What can we say? They really lost their sovereignty in this matter. And the United States, with the transition actors of globalism, they use various technologies to make people and countries lose their sovereignty. So, for instance, the very existence of Russia also was under threat because sovereignty is understood today like in an integral sense, and which is manifested by all the spheres: the economy, the technology, the culture, the ideas, the values. So all those are very important trends, the movements towards gaining full sovereignty of Russia. And that's why this trend is worth speaking about. So very dangerous threat of glorifying Nazism and the spread of other radical extremist movements. So every year, at the proposal of Russia at the UN General Assembly to adopt the resolution to combat glorification of Nazism and neo-Nazism, other parties just don't support that. Each time the United States and Ukraine voted against this resolution, and in 2022 other groups of Western countries joined them, they refused to accept this situation. Meanwhile, the situation with Nazism has already been very difficult. It is politically revived. And we cannot ignore those increasing xenophobic sentiments. So Nazi figures of the past have been rehabilitated, glorified. The Nazi symbols are being distributed, and there are real threats of repetition of genocide practices. And it is actually taking place in some countries. After the coup d'etat, as I said, in Ukraine in 2014, Ukraine started to introduce and operate as partly as a Nazi state, because some monuments to glorify the leaders of Nazi were established. And the Russia is a successor of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union made a decisive contribution to the victory over Nazi in the 20th century. We were at the forefront of the forces which countered the terrorism in the World War. We can't stand that. We can't stand the Nazi threat. And this decision was also reflected in the reasons to start the special military operation in the Ukraine. One of the goals was the denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine. And you know, this situation when in Canadian Parliament the Nazi leaders are invited and glorified, it is really serious. And furthermore, it has its reflection in other conduct of other countries, including Israel right now in Gaza, when some xenophobic and genocidal comportments are taking place. Trends of formation of consumer society is another trend. So the logical state of the development of modern capitalism society is, of course, the foundation of consumerism or consumer society. The consumer society is obvious. The further movement in the direction of consumerism, it on the one hand is something positive. It provides, it can hardly ensure the reproduction of its own culture and experience, but it doesn't provide consolidation and social solidarity. It's primarily focused on values and values of consumer behavior. And there comes the understanding in modern society and in Russia that modern crises are essentially anthropological crisis, and we're talking about not only the loss of necessity of commodities, but abandoning the priority of this type of values in the society. These are the main trends and the main features of the development of Russian society, and I hope that you enjoyed our lecture, and hope to see you in RENEPA, Russian Academy of National Economy and Public Administration, Volgograd Institute of Management branch. So, and we will have the opportunity to discuss those questions with you in details. Thank you very much, and goodbye.